Well, welcome to the sixth presidential lecture of this type. I am delighted that we have such a wonderful audience today. As some of you know, when I became president of this institution, I wanted to bring a level of expertise to our campus that reflected our wonderful university. Also, some of you may be following what is happening with the City University of New York and know that under the guidance and leadership of Matthew Goldstein, our chancellor, we have moved from what is called, what used to be a federation of 17 independent colleges to a university with 17 campuses. And based on that strength, I felt that it was important that we would take advantage of the fact that we are part of a major university. And frankly, I have not double-checked this, but my understanding is that the City University of New York has the largest number of Nobel Prize winners on staff than any other urban public university in the country. And that tells you the level of quality that we have. Well, I am delighted to tell you that today we have one of the best. There is such a thing as a distinguished professor rank in our university. I happen to have the privilege of serving on the committee that selects these individuals. And before I go any farther, let me introduce one of my bosses, Trustee Wellington Chen, who is the one who votes on the distinguished professors. And I am going to read from the small little print that you all have because it is meritorious. I think it's important that we follow what we are, the caliber of the individual that we're seeing today. Dr. Mollenkopf, as a distinguished professor of political science and sociology at the CUNY Graduate Center, coordinates the interdisciplinary concentration in public policy and urban studies. He has authored or edited 10 books on urban politics, urban policy, the politics of urban development, and New York City. Prior to joining the Graduate Center in 1981, he directed the Economic Development Division of New York City Department of City Planning and taught urban studies and public management at Stanford University. He received his Ph.D. from Harvard and his B.A. from Carleton College. Mollenkopf's Place Matters, a Metropolitics of the 21st Century, is a book published by the University Press of Kansas. It was co-authored with Peter Dreyer and Todd Swanstrom. It received the 2002 Michael Harrington Award from the American Political Science Association New Politics Session. I have done that just to give you a taste. You can all read, you can all follow. I suggest that you do because we are in for a treat. We are in for a person who not only understands the statistics, an individual who has studied New York City, but an individual who in fact has been a person who has helped plan what is happening in New York City. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce to you the distinguished professor, Dr. John Mollenkopf.
Thanks for that warm welcome. Can you all hear me? Have I got the microphone where it should be? Louder, some say? Well, I'm not an expert in Queens, so I'm a little bit here under false pretenses, and partly because I know that you're the experts in Queens, and I'm looking forward to the period of our session together in which you can ask me questions and I can ask you questions, and perhaps I can learn some more from you. I am an expert in the changing demographic patterns in New York City, and especially as they're revealed in census data, and I've worked a good deal on electoral and political patterns in New York City as well as in Queens. And those are areas that I feel more confident in saying I know what I'm talking about, as opposed to what might be happening, say, here in Bayside. But Queens is particularly interesting to me and important to the city because it is among the most diverse urban counties in the United States today. Los Angeles likes to say that it's the city that contains a little piece of everywhere else in the world, but Queens could very definitely give Los Angeles a run for its money. It's one of the most interesting urban experiments in the United States. So it's a pleasure to have a chance to reflect a little bit on what the official statistics say about what's going on here, and to interact with you. And so what I'm going to do today is to give you a kind of overview of what the census statistics say, partly in some charts and partly in some maps. So I hope you're not averse to seeing a few charts and maps. It's a kind of the prop of the academic. And I'll try to reflect on what some of the implications are of what I'm going to show you. First, the overall trends that are happening in the New York City population and the Queens population as reflected in both the 1990 and 2000 censuses. I think we're pretty well all aware that the native-born, native-stock white population of New York City has been decreasing. Population is aging, fewer children are born into the white population, people move to the suburbs, move to other parts of the U.S., so it's not surprising that population is declining. But I'm not sure people understand that the other older ethnic groups, the kinds of groups that Moynihan and Glaser wrote about in Beyond the Melting Pot in 1960, are also declining in New York City. The Puerto Rican population and the Native African American population. That is, people born here of parents who are also born here. And both those groups are declining. Good, that's working. And if that had been the only thing going on demographically, the city of New York would be getting smaller and smaller, and Queens would be getting smaller. But we know that, in fact, the overall population has been rising, and that's primarily due to immigration. And immigrants have made up for the decline in the other groups. And as in opposition to what happened at the turn of the last century, the 1880s through the 1910s, these immigrants are coming from many different parts of the world. The biggest groups of immigrants are from Asia and Latin America, but there are also black and white immigrants. Black immigrants from the Anglophone Caribbean and white immigrants, the biggest group of whom are from the former Soviet Union. And these groups are mixing it up with each other in interesting ways and creating very diverse new kinds of neighborhoods. And Queens is a wonderful example, probably one of the best examples of in the country of these types of neighborhoods. And I'll say more about them later. But I'm sure you've seen it all in the neighborhoods that you live in. And with the change in population comes a change in political representation, in who's in the electorate, who's running for office, what kinds of groups there might be, tensions there might be between different groups in the society. We all know that ethnic politics is one of the main facets of New York City politics. We know about the Irish politicians and the Tammany Hall machine and the attempt of the Italians and Jewish immigrants, descendants of immigrants, to become a more prominent part of the political system. And that goes on today with new groups trying to break into the system. There is a fundamental civil rights aspect to this because 37% of the people in New York City are foreign-born, and a large majority of those are not citizens. Not a large majority, but a majority of those people are not citizens. And we know immigrants are clustered in certain neighborhoods, so there could well be neighborhoods where half of the adults are not able to vote. They have to pay taxes, they are good citizens, hardworking, contributing to their community, but they can't exercise the franchise. And just, in my view, just as the question of equal rights, equal political rights for African Americans was the key national issue from the 1950s through the 60s, 70s, and 80s, I think the issue of immigrants becoming part of the political system is a major civil rights issue today. Well, this just gives you the broad outline of who lives in New York City according to where they were born. There we go. And this blue line are people born in the United States. And you can see that went up from 1950 to 1970, but it went down pretty consistently from 1970 to 2000. And if that was all we had in New York City, we would be a city of 6 million people instead of a city of 8 million people. And the difference is made up by immigrants, as you can see. And in fact, from 1980 to the present, the city's population has gone up rather than down because of this contribution of immigrants to our population. Now, this shows the city as a whole for 1990 and 2000, and Queens for 1990 and 2000. And you can see the different colors on the right-hand side break out the different groups. So green, dark green is native-born, non-Hispanic whites. That's this group. And you can see that group has declined, as the previous slides indicate, pretty substantially between 1990 and 2000, both in the city and in Queens. And you can see a rather, if you just look at the white population, the immigrant share is pretty considerable at this point. Something like 200,000 people came from the former Soviet Union alone during the decade of the 1990s into New York City. Okay, so interestingly, here is the native-born non-Hispanic black population. It too is shrinking, although it seems like it's pretty much static in Queens. And this is the immigrant black population. We're talking Jamaicans, people from all the other different islands that make up the Anglophone West Indies and Haiti. The native-born Latino population has been growing, and that's the next bar here. The colors don't quite come out as well as they do on my screen, sorry about that. And you can see that the foreign-born Hispanic population is growing even faster than the native-born. And a lot of the growth in the native-born Hispanic population are children of immigrants. So this is the native-born Asian population, very small, very few Asian people were actually born here. And you can see a much larger population of foreign-born Asian people. And if you just look at the multicolored nature of the bars in 2000 for the city as a whole and for Queens, it gives you an appreciation for this idea of an urban mosaic, or a pot that might or might not melt. This gives you, for 1990 and 2000, for each of the basic racial groups, whites, blacks, Latinos, and Asians, not just the breakdown in terms of natives, as we saw before in immigrants, but also citizens and non-citizens. And the reason that I show you this bar is that in every case, you can see an increase in the number of foreign-born people who've become citizens. During the 1990s, a number of things happened in national legislation, welfare reform, the California Prop 187, and so forth, that really stimulated foreign-born people in New York City to acquire citizenship. Many of the sending countries also began to adopt measures to allow for dual citizenship. Previously, I think people often remained citizens of their home country because they wanted to be able to keep property there, to invest, whatever, that previously had been discouraged if you weren't a citizen of that country. And the adoption of dual citizenship, plus measures on our end of the arc of immigration, encouraged a lot of immigration. A lot of naturalization. So here's just a map of percentage foreign-born of the population by census tract. And note that the bright red category is 60% or more. And you can see many parts, Jackson Heights, Corona, Flushing, I guess we're over right about there. But even where we are is 1/5 to 1/3 foreign-born in this immediate neighborhood surrounding here. So even neighborhoods like this one that we're in, basically in middle to upper middle class, fairly suburban part of New York City, we can see that immigration has had a very strong effect. And of course, in areas like Jackson Heights, a really quite spectacular change has taken place there. We're used to a society that has racial divisions in it. What effect has immigration had on that? Well, in my mind, it's really blurred a lot of the old racial divisions in the city. Partly because the immigrants come from so many different parts of the world. And they don't fit neatly into the Native American racial hierarchy that developed from the period of slavery through the Civil War, through the period of the migration from the north to the south and industrialization in the 19th and 20th centuries in the United States. That's not to say immigration has completely erased those boundaries. It's just modified them. Immigrants have to settle in neighborhoods that are still marked by a basic underlying pattern of black-white segregation. And black immigrants tend to settle in black neighborhoods, but not in the old historic cores of those black neighborhoods. It's very interesting how Afro-Caribbeans live in different parts of black neighborhoods than African Americans. And similarly, white immigrants have settled in historically white neighborhoods. The Brighton Beach center of Russian immigration in Brooklyn, for example, is a long-time old Jewish neighborhood of New York City, where the population had been aging before, and it was very natural for this new population to move in and create a new community. And Latin immigrants and Asian immigrants are finding spaces that are somewhere in between the white and black neighborhoods, although they're also moving into white and white neighborhoods in particular, making them more diverse. Now, I'm going to just run through a series of maps that show you where each racial group lives. And the first map will be the native-born, and the second map will be the foreign-born of that group. So here is where native-born whites live. And again, you know, this part of Queens is predominantly white, and Forest Hills and so on, and even, you know, Astoria and parts of Long Island City. Now, this is where white immigrants are moving. And you can see the influx of residents of the former Soviet Union there, for example, in the Kew Gardens Forest Hills area. Native-born blacks born in the United States. We know Jamaica is a black neighborhood, and certainly black central Brooklyn, Harlem, and so on. And that geography is pretty familiar to us. This is where immigrant blacks are living. So if I switch back and forth, so there's native blacks, there's immigrant blacks. You can see that the West Indians are they're not evenly spread throughout southeast Queens. They're concentrated along the Nassau border. So this is native-born Hispanics, and that means Puerto Ricans primarily, but some children of immigrants. And in Jackson Heights, there is a pretty substantial native-born population, but it's much more immigrant. And if we go back, certain neighborhoods like the Lower East Side and Williamsburg, that are very Puerto Rican neighborhoods, are also, they're less slightly, if you look at where all the immigrant Hispanics live, they're less likely to live in some of these original zones of settlement. Now, I didn't map native-born Asians because there are very few of them, but you can see also huge Asian populations in both Flushing and Corona, Elmhurst, Jackson Heights, and so on. So if you begin to think about how all these groups coincide with each other, overlap with each other, you get some really interesting combinations. I think historically unprecedented combinations of people. And if you think of the arc of neighborhoods from Jackson Heights to Flushing, and Puerto Ricans, Dominicans, South Americans, Chinese, Koreans, Indians, all living within pretty close proximity with one another. And I've seen signs in that under the L on, is it Roosevelt Avenue I'm thinking of, where it says shoes in Chinese, Korean, and Spanish. Where else on earth are you going to see a sign that happens to be in those three languages? Or as you wander around these neighborhoods, I'm sure that you see amazing juxtapositions of a Chinese restaurant and say a Colombian restaurant, and then some other strange kind of, Cuban Chinese restaurant. I mean, we've got all kinds of strange combinations in New York City. The area probably less familiar to you, but that I've been wandering around in, is another part of Queens. It's in between Jamaica and Brooklyn, that whole area of Richmond Hill on Ozone Park, which has an amazing profusion of South Asian groups. You have Muslims from Pakistan and Bangladesh, and some Muslims from India. You have Indians from India who are definitely not Muslim. You have Guyanese and Indo-Guyanese from the Caribbean who are maybe of Indian heritage but grew up in the Caribbean. West Indian, African and Afro-Caribbean West Indians who just grew up in the Caribbean. And nearby are also a number of different Hispanic groups, Latino groups. Just, again, an amazing array of people from different parts of the globe. I'll skip over Sunset Park because I know nobody from Queens ever goes to Brooklyn. Now, these are just a series of slides for that Jackson Heights to Flushing area. And if you look at the scale, the darkest means that there's at least 1,000 people from that background in that census tract. And the average census tract has about 3,000 people in it in the city as a whole. So, you have some pretty strong concentrations of Puerto Ricans. Dominicans. I just looked at the numbers now. There are just about as many Dominicans as Puerto Ricans in Queens. And they kind of undercounted Dominicans in the last census because of a mistake they made with the question about how they asked about Hispanic origin. So there are probably many more Dominicans than are indicated in the official statistics. So you see some Dominicans in the neighborhood where there were also Puerto Ricans, but you see a big Dominican concentration up in Corona, I guess that is. These are people from Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru, and there are about 50 to 60,000 people counted in the census from Colombia and Ecuador, and another 20,000 or so from Peru. So that's just in Queens. That's in a very big population. And if I just go back, you can see how they're kind of nestled in next to each other. And then the Chinese population. Overlapping, nearby, a little bit distinct. Sort of sub-areas of concentration within an overall larger area of concentration. And then Indians, people from South Asia. And Koreans. We know that the Korean clustering, there's some here in Elmhurst, but there's even more in Flushing. And this is, Bayside over here. So this neighborhood, for example, is becoming more of a Korean neighborhood. I'm sure you are aware of that. Let me just go back and run through all those again. Quite a remarkable meshing of people from quite disparate origins, different languages, different cultures, different ways of thinking about the world, different political traditions. And I would say also, again, I'll click through all of these. The impact is even stronger and more rapid and more profound on young people than it is on the society as a whole. Because the white population, the native population, and not just the white population, but the native black and the native Puerto Rican populations are aging. Those groups have been around for a long time. Their fertility rates are lower. Probably many of your children are off somewhere else in other parts of the United States pursuing their careers. And the young people are immigrants and children of immigrants. And certainly we see it within the City University. In 1998, I did a study for the Chancellor's Office predicting that more than half of the CUNY students would be immigrants or children of immigrants by 2002. And it turned out we were very conservative in that estimate because it's something like virtually 60 to 65% today. So the City University really, as it has historically done, is serving as that key stepping stone for the new immigrants and their children into the middle class in New York City and the United States. And this has lots of implications, not just for the City University, but for all kinds of youth-related institutions, the public schools most obviously. I heard the other day that there were something like 140 different languages spoken by children in the New York City school system. And I know that I and most other teachers in the system, we're lucky if we speak English, much less English in another language. So imagine the challenge of trying to absorb people from so many different backgrounds and get them learning English and to preserve the language that they arrive with, because that's an important asset to us to have so many people. If the next generation and the generation after that lost their Chinese, for example, and China is the biggest nation on earth and going to become ever more important in the decades ahead, we would really be, robbing ourselves of a very important asset in New York City. So it's not just incorporating people into English and improving their ability to negotiate the larger society, but to also preserve the language of the family and the language of the country of origin. Now, the impact on politics has been a heck of a lot slower than the impact on the population as a whole, or the youth population. And that is, the most obvious reason is you have to be 18 years old or older and you have to be a citizen to vote. So right there's a major hurdle that groups have to get over to even be eligible to participate in the electoral system. And it would be obvious from the preceding slides that the white population is much more likely to be a voting age citizen. That's what BAC stands for there. Interestingly, African Americans are also a little bit advantaged by the age of the population and the fact that they're Americans. In fact, if you count in terms of people born here and people who are born to, whose parents were also born here, blacks are the most native born, the most American of any of the groups in New York City. Actually, the white population has a stronger immigrant heritage than African Americans. Latinos are kind of somewhat split because Puerto Ricans, of course, are citizens. So they may be migrants to New York City historically, but they come with citizenship. But most of the growth in the Latino population has been from non-citizen immigrants, and of course, almost all the growth among Asians. And interestingly, even when people become citizens who are foreign-born, there's a great deal of variation in terms of how likely they are to register to vote, whether they join a party. You know, when you register to vote, you can either designate one of the listed parties or just decline to state a party preference. And of course, rates of voting. So the Asian new citizens seem to be particularly uninclined to pick a party. And this may be, I'm not sure exactly why this is, but you could imagine that it could be because people are pretty fed up with the politics of China. They don't have a good image of what a political party should be if their model is the Chinese Communist Party, or even the KMT in Taiwan. So they don't pick a party. And if you're not a member of a political party, then you can't vote in the party primary. And that's maybe later on, if you want, we could get into the whole issue of the nonpartisan election reform that's coming up. So Asians in particular are a little less likely to pitch in and join the political system than the other groups. And if you're not a party registrant, then the people who call you up, and I'm sure all of you get bothered incessantly around election time with tons of mail and telephone calls and those automated calls, and it's probably driving you nuts. But there's lots of people in New York City who don't get those calls and don't get that mail because they're not regular, steady voters and they're not registered in a party. So nobody is reaching out to them and saying, come, participate in our system. So it's not just that they are less inclined to participate, it's that we don't ask them as much to participate either. Yet, as we know, certainly from the 2001 election here in Queens, which broke a couple of historic barriers, things are changing slowly and steadily. And in exit polls that I've done with a colleague up at Barnard, we have found that a quarter of the voters in municipal elections are foreign-born, people who become naturalized. That's a pretty big share. And that's also confirmed by the media's exit poll that was conducted in the 2001 mayoral election. We got them to add a question to the standard questions about race and religion and so on, about place of birth. Now I just want to show you quickly how citizenship is a kind, and voting age is a kind of filter. This is New York City population, this is New York City voting age citizens in 1990. And here's the same thing for 2000. So you see in both bars, whites are far more of the electorate than they are of the population. But you can also see that this bar declined substantially from about 55% to 45%. So whites are less than half of the eligible electorate now in New York City. The same patterns are even more pronounced in Queens, because here whites were like 64% of the voting age citizens in Queens in 1990, and it's down to about 46% now, a very sharp drop. And to the extent that demography is destiny in politics, that's important. And the patterns are similar for whites. For Hispanics, again, you can see that if you take the Queens population in 2000, Hispanics are more of it than they are of the voting age citizens. But this, if you compare this back to this, you can see a big growth in the Hispanic electorate. And the final bar just shows the same thing for Asians. And even though, if we look at Queens, even though Asians are roughly 10% of the more than 10%, I think, of the population, didn't come quite out right for some reason. If you go back to here, in 1990, Asians were a fraction of a percent of the electorate. And that has grown very substantially to 2000. Okay, some of the obvious implications. We've shifted from a white majority of voters, of people in the electorate in New York City, to a white plurality. Whites are still the single largest group, but they're no longer a majority. And that change happened in the population as a whole quite some time ago, but it's finally now happened in the electorate as well. Now, how do these new citizens that were apparent in the previous bar charts and who are becoming, at least potentially, part of the New York City political scene, how are they fitting in? What do we know about who they like, who they don't like, and how much they vote and how much they don't vote? Well, it turns out that West Indians vote very, very much like African Americans. There are little differences. They're a little bit more conservative, or let's say a little bit less liberal. Home ownership rates are very high among West Indians. Self-employment is pretty high. And the kind of small business mentality of we don't want to pay too many taxes and we want government not to over-regulate us and so on. And that kind of mindset is a little more prevalent in the West Indian community. And similarly, immigrant whites vote like native white. Native whites are the most Republican constituency in the city. And if anything, the Russian new citizens are among the more conservative voters in New York City. And that also is for obvious reasons. I mean, they were persecuted in the Soviet Union, and their passports as Jews were stamped as a racial minority, and they were discriminated, in everyday life. And so that there's no love lost for anything on the left among the Soviet immigrant population. The case of Latino immigrants is more diverse. Dominicans vote with the second biggest group, and probably in 10 years a group that will be bigger than the Puerto Rican population in New York City, vote very much like Puerto Ricans. And Puerto Ricans are a quite democratic constituency. They're not as democratic as black voters, where in contested municipal elections, somewhere between 8 out of 10 and 9 out of 10, or even 9.5 out of 10 blacks will vote for the Democratic candidate. The Puerto Ricans and Dominicans are more like 6 out of 10 to 7 out of 10 voting for the Democratic candidate. But there's huge diversity among the different Latino immigrant groups, and the Colombians, Ecuadorians, and Peruvians, the South Americans in particular, see themselves as somewhat distinct from Dominicans. There are a lot of cultural and historical differences between South America and the Latin Caribbean that contribute to that. Mexicans have also been very rapidly growing in New York City. Very recent arrivals, very few citizens. We don't really know much about what Mexican new citizens are going to be like in New York City. But my guess, judging on what Mexican-American voters have been like in California and Texas and so on, is that they will be like Puerto Ricans and Dominicans, a basically fairly democratic and liberal, in some respects, constituency. And as I mentioned before, Asians are much more on the fence than the other immigrant groups. They're higher income, there's more highly educated people in the population, more business self-employment, more home ownership. If I were the Republican Party's sort of strategic planner for how the party would develop in New York City, I would say that you should make a major effort to recruit Asian candidates, run Asian candidates, and contact Asian voters, because of all the immigrant groups, that's apart from the Russians, quite possibly your most fertile territory. At the same time, there are a lot of very low-income Asian Chinese families. There is a sense of being discriminated against to a certain degree. So I think there's also room for the Democrats, at least in some parts of that population. And, you know, sort of time will tell exactly how things work out. So I'm coming to the end. I'll say a few things about the last election cycle here, both at the mayoral and primary election. In the Democratic primary in Queens in 2001, Green, Ferrer, and Vallone each got about 27% of the vote. They were very evenly matched. And perhaps you could explain to me why Mr. Hevesy, who's a very prominent Queens politician, didn't do better. I'm sure there are stories behind that. I understand why the other candidates might have done as well as they did, but I'm not sure why Mr. Hevesy didn't do better in Queens. Interestingly, when it came down to the Green versus Ferrer runoff, the Democratic vote that had gone to Vallone and Hevesy, I would say shifted fairly substantially to Green in the runoff, and allowed him to not only beat Ferrer here in Queens, but also contributed to this very narrow margin in the runoff election. And that election was actually much closer when the votes were finally all counted than even was said on election eve. And I think Green only won the election by about 20,000 votes. But interestingly, in the general election, Bloomberg did much better than Green in Queens, and marginally better, about 40,000 votes better than Green in the city as a whole. The general election vote was twice as large as the Democratic primary vote in Queens. So in other words, half the people who ended up voting in the general election were not so interested in the Democratic primary and didn't participate in it. So the Democratic primary, which usually is a pretty good guide in other parts of the city to how the general election will go, was a much less good indicator of that here. And clearly, a number of people who supported Green against Ferrer turned around to support Mayor Bloomberg against Mark Green in the general election. So this is just a map of where Bloomberg got his support, and the deep red is 70% or more for Bloomberg, and you could, if you're good at reading maps, you can probably pick out where you live and get an idea of what your neighbors were doing in that election. Black neighborhoods, clearly, you know, the historic black neighborhood in Corona and Jamaica, Southeast Queens were the strongest pro-Green territory. And again, the sort of Forest Hills, Kew Gardens area, and I'm not sure exactly where John Gotti used to live, but it's down there somewhere. And these parts of Queens that are more familiar to you are basically the mayor's turf. And it's interesting that this narrow band of yellow election districts are sort of in between the two areas. They also happen to be areas where there's more Asian Indian settlement than in other parts of the city. But I just thought you might like to see the electoral geography there. And this shows you the Green percent in the runoff versus the Green percent in the general election for a series of Queens neighborhoods. And by Flushing, I mean from Flushing all the way over to the Nassau line. So these are bigger neighborhoods than just those terms might indicate. And you can see that Green got the lowest vote in historically black neighborhoods, and the most vote in Queens Village, we know, is a sort of classic white ethnic enclave. I'm of German descent myself, and sometimes I go in search of things like sausages from Karl Ehmer or something like that. And I know where they make them out there in Queensland. But then if you look at what he got in the general election, the curve, which had sort of gone that way in the runoff, just reverses and goes this way in the general election. So the minority constituencies that were the base of the Democratic Party also stuck with Mark Green, despite the fact that he wasn't their guy in the runoff. And the white neighborhoods that had supported Green and got him into the general election went with Bloomberg rather decisively in the general election. History was made in the 2001 council elections here in Queens. We elected our first Chinese American, Asian American member of the city council. So we have a Asian population that is almost 11% in New York City. And so now 1 out of 51 council people is Asian American. You could say, well, we need more progress than that, but at least we've made some progress. And Queens also elected its first Latino city council person, Hiram Monserrate. That was a particularly interesting race, I think, because Monserrate did not win on the Puerto Rican vote in that district. There was another Puerto Rican candidate who was a favorite of the borough president who got most of the Puerto Rican votes. And although the Puerto Rican votes were kind of spread around among a number of candidates. So it seems that it was black votes and South American votes in particular that helped Monserrate defeat a Dominican candidate and another Puerto Rican candidate. So I'm not sure I quite understand the logic behind those ethnic alignments, but it shows you the complexity of the grassroots politics that's going on here in the borough. Also, another Chinese candidate did lose to a white candidate in a district that is one of the most Chinese in the city, indicating that there's still a long way to go for that group to become active participants in city politics. So, to conclude, what do I see is going on in the city? Well, very dramatic change, much more dramatic in the population than in the electorate, but inevitably, sooner or later, in the electorate as well. A lot of old boundaries are being blurred by the changes that are going on. A lot of the old distinctions that we thought were just normal, inevitable parts of the landscape are being gradually eroded. And very new, different, hybrid ethnicities are emerging in New York City. And just as Fiorello LaGuardia was a kind of perfect candidate for depression here in New York City because he was Italian on one side and Jewish on the other side and raised as an Episcopalian and spoke Yiddish. I'm sure we will see people, maybe graduates of Queensborough Community College, with, think a Chinese kid and an Indian kid will, come here to school and they'll meet each other and they'll start going out and they'll form a family and we'll have offspring that are, a combination that can only happen here in New York City. So we can think of a future that's going to be as complex and as interesting and as hybrid as any time in New York City's past. Our politics are still marked by racial polarization. And if you did a correlation between where Mike Bloomberg got his vote, where Rudy Giuliani got his vote, and where Ed Koch got his vote, very similar, very high correlation since 1977. So we're talking about 25-year, quarter of a century span. And similarly on the other side, the places where their opponents got their vote, very, very high correlation. The balance of power, though, is shifting. The underlying base from which those mayors drew their vote is diminishing over time. It's becoming a lesser part of the overall electorate. And the whole, that if you remember back to those initial multicolored bars, the hues, the spectrum of the electorate is changing. But just because the city is becoming less white doesn't mean that it's becoming more black. It's becoming much more diverse. So the challenge is really, how will all these different groups that are not white learn to work with each other and to forge some kind of common politics? That's the challenge that faces us, I think. But I think we're also making progress in the 2001 election, and some of the council elections that happened here in Queens shows how that progress is being made. So for somebody like me who studies New York City politics and ethnic politics and immigration and race, this is, I couldn't be in a better place to study what I'm interested in. And I'm sure that I'll have plenty of material to keep me going for decades to come. So thank you for your patience with all these charts.
Dr. Mollenkopf has agreed to answer some questions. I'm certain there are many. But before we do that, I want to thank Dr. Sheena Gillespie, who some time ago, when this was just starting, had the courage to say, let's go and bring CUNY from wherever it is to Queensboro, and I think it's been a successful and wonderful venture. And Sheena, thank you so much for that. Also, we are in a fundraising mode, and if any of you are willing to run for office or have designs to run for office, we can certainly provide Dr. Mollenkopf's services for a fee to Queensboro Community College. It's a joke.
This is a nonpartisan institute.
So I'm certain that's a question.
Please, just shout it out. On balance, I favor the retention of partisan elections. That's not to say there aren't some good arguments being made by the Charter Revision Commission, and Alan Gardner, who was the executive director, is a very old and dear friend and a former dean of research at the Graduate Center, and Frank Macchiarola, the chair, is another old friend. So I think were given a mission by the mayor and carried it out, and I don't think the Charter Revision Commission carefully considered all the pros and cons, because they had a place they were trying to get and did go there. The best argument in favor of nonpartisanship is that everyone who is not essentially a registered Democrat doesn't get to vote in the primary to nominate the candidate that will come into the election with the backing of the party that has the most registered voters. And especially among Asians, about 45% of whom have declined to state a party when they register, that does, as I say, impede their participation in the electoral system. On the other hand, if you get rid of parties are the agencies that develop leadership, that put it forward, that support it, that connect elected officials with the voters. There are district leaders, there are political clubs. I, for some reason that I can't completely fathom, and represent my election district in the Kings County Democratic Committee. I guess the club had nobody better to put into that job, but I take it as my duty to know who's a registered Democrat in my election district, and I'll go around and I'll talk to them. I'll find out what they're thinking. I'll tell them what I recommend they do in the election. Now, in a nonpartisan election, all of that goes away. The only linkage between the voter and the candidate is the candidate's campaign, the size of the contributions, how good a set of, a campaign manager and campaign mechanics they put together, what kind of mailing they do, how much money they spend on media, if they spend it on, cable TV or the various ways. So the relationship between you and the candidate, which under our current system is mediated by an organization that holds them accountable to a certain extent evaporates, and we go further into this domain of money talks and politics, and it's all who has the best pollster and who does the slickest media. So that is my fundamental. That is a fundamental criticism I have. The other fundamental criticism I have is that the minority groups in the main in New York City are more likely to be Democrats than white citizen voting age people are. And so the fact that they have that strength within the Democratic Party to some extent offsets all the other disadvantages that minority voters experience in our system. We all know that the older you are, the more educated you are, the more likely you are to be a property owner, the bigger your income, the more likely you are to vote. Whites excel in all those categories. If you looked at the prime voters, older white people like myself, and maybe some of you in the audience, are the religiously steady voters. I even go to vote in, elections where the only candidate is a municipal court judge or something like that. That's not true of minority groups. So if the party is a way of helping groups that have historically been underrepresented keep some kind of leverage within the system. And I think in such a diverse city, that's really important. What the Charter Revision Commission has said that I deeply agree with is that political competition is the lifeblood of a democratic system. If you don't have a competitive system, what's the point of voting? We know who's going to run. They're the same old people that have been there always. They may like me, they may not like me, but nothing I do is going to change it. If you have close competition, then, well, maybe my vote makes a difference. Maybe my effort makes a difference. I'm going to get more involved. I see a person that I like better than the person that's in there that has a chance to get in. So he's going to ask me or she's going to ask me to come help them, and I'll do that. So we've had quite fierce and close competition at the mayoral level. Most of the mayoral elections in recent years have been fairly close. Certainly the two Giuliani-Dinkins elections in this latest one, they were all won by less than 50,000 votes. So, and the mayoral level tends to drive, what's at the top of the ticket drives turnout. This next election on Tuesday is not going to see very many people come out because there are no competitive elections, really. There's only a couple of competitive council races in the entire city, and only the people who are sort of habitual good citizens will come out and vote, and maybe the friends of some of the people who are up for office. So how do we get more competition? I would say that nonpartisanship is the wrong way. That the right way is to get the parties. I think the Republican parties should pick more competitive candidates in Democratic parts of the city, and the Democrats, of course, should pick more competitive candidates in the Republican parts of the city. If I could just briefly comment on that. Of course, there are a lot of little neighborhoods that are predominantly this group or predominantly that group, and it makes sense for that group to elect a person very much of their own ethnic background. But as a city as a whole, we're extremely diverse, and there's no one person of a given background that's going to represent all the different flavors of New Yorkers. So I think our politics also has to get beyond the ethnic differences that divide us to get to what is really common and bonds us together, like education and the importance of having a literate and numerate and intellectually nimble and culturally nimble next generation growing up in New York City. So I second your comment. The questioner said that Puerto Ricans are culturally quite different from people from other Latin American countries, so why are they lumped together? And of course, Puerto Rico is a commonwealth of the United States, and other countries are independent countries. Well, Puerto Ricans are counted both as Hispanics because of the Spanish language heritage, and that is something that I think crosses a lot of borders. Although I'm sure that the accent in which you speak Spanish means something in certain settings. But of course, there's a huge difference because Puerto Ricans are part of the United States and are citizens and have a long heritage of political and civil activism that the other groups may not have. So, the census counts people a lot of different ways, and under certain headings they're lumped together with other Hispanics, but they're also broken out separately as Puerto Ricans as well. And I think it's, the Puerto Rican community in New York is the biggest Spanish-speaking group and has historically faced some of the most difficult circumstances in terms of coming to New York as relatively poor people and entering into manufacturing industry, especially the garment industry, at a period in which it then went through an historic decline and contraction. And the struggle to get better jobs and get a better education is a very fundamental one in the Puerto Rican community.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for the opportunity.
Two dates. One, Friday of this week, Senator Schumer will be here. It's our understanding to welcome a group of new citizens. We have our immigration ceremony that we do every semester at this campus. And Senator Schumer is known to have said at the John Doe inaugural, as a matter of fact, that New York City is the place where immigrants become citizens. And I have always said that Queensboro is the place where immigrants become educated citizens. So please be around and welcome those immigrants. And finally, on March 24, you have to take your calendars out right now and mark them, because on March 24, we're going to have the other presidential lecture of the year, which, as those of you who are regulars to these lectures know, it's one of ours. So in the fall we have one person, a distinguished professor from the university, and in the spring we have a distinguished professor from Queensboro Community College. And I'm delighted to tell you that we're going to use symbols again. Now we use numbers, and the numbers came alive, as somebody said. In March we're going to use notes, and it's going to be music. And our distinguished lecturer is Professor Martin Kalknowski, who, as a matter of fact, I had the privilege of attending Carnegie Hall to listen to one of his compositions, and he's going to talk about the teaching of music at a community college. So please mark your calendars, March 22nd. And now join us outside for a reception, and again, thank you for coming.